When we are stressed, our body and therefore our brain, they're already responding as if they are under threat. We are ready to respond as if this is the most serious thing that's ever happened.
Totally.
And most of the conflicts at work, they're annoying,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not deadly.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, they are not even a challenge to people's employment.
Mm-hmm.
They're more a challenge to either tradition or to our egos.
Do you consider yourself a high achiever? Smart, driven, highly successful? I am so excited to have you. My name is Julia Arndt, and I'm the host of the Stress Podcast. I will help you develop your stress resilience the same way you've developed your workplace superpowers. Learn peak performance tools to thrive at work and in your personal life. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome back to the Stress Podcast. I'm your host, Julia Arndt, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the next podcast episode. Today, after a couple of episodes of recording to you solo, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest to the show. And today it's Liz Kislik. Hey, Liz, how are you today?
I'm good, Julia. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited to be sitting here with you today and chatting with you about all the things. So, before we jump into more specific questions about who you are, I always start my podcast episode with three really simple questions. And the questions are: where are you located? What time is it? And what have you been up to today before jumping on the call with us?
So I'm on Long Island in New York in the US. It is now 1:15 p.m. in the afternoon. And today already, let's see, I had a very good workout this morning.
Nice.
I was on another podcast
Okay.
and I've been doing some email in between.
Okay. Very nice. Liz, tell us a little bit more about you. What have you been up to over the last couple of years, and what are you most passionate about?
So I am a management consultant and executive coach.
Hmm.
And that's because I love this work.
Hmm.
I've been doing it a very long time, much more than the last few years. But in the last few years, it has been really both an honor and a privilege to be able to work with a lot of family businesses.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's very exciting because you are dealing with people's lives as well as their work,
Hmm.
multiple generations. They are committed to it in a very visceral, intense way. And I'm very happy with that. Very recently, about 2 months ago, I actually turned my business into a family business. I hired my son,
Amazing.
and it has been amazing.
Aw,
Yes,
that is
it's
amazing.
it's
And
really
so,
wonderful.
tell us, have you always done management consulting, or was there a transition from you working in corporate and then making the transition to consulting and coaching?
My first job after college was for a marketing agency,
Okay.
which was also a family business, not my
Hmm.
family, but a family business.
Hmm.
And I, oh, I learned so much there, Julia. You could not have paid
Hmm.
for that education. When I was 23, I was a vice president and managing a 300 employee call center.
Wow.
Too hard. I mean, it was really, I wasn't really prepared for it. I learned so much doing it, very challenging. I was there all told about 8 years before I
Okay.
started my practice.
I see. Amazing. Wow. With 23 managing a whole call center, that sounds challenging.
Oddly, it's the kind of thing that happens in family business much more than it would in a classic corporate environment.
Hmm.
Um, you often make the best of what's there The fellow who had had the job before me was fairly new. He was brought in from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't fit the culture. Um, he was of a different style, was not effective, wasn't getting the job done. Um, I don't think they had expected to turn to me. They had expected this fellow would work out, but it didn't work out. And so this is what we did.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so inspiring. And so in 2017, you gave a TED Talk on why there's so much conflict at work and what you can do about it. How was that process? How did you get to speak on a TEDx stage?
Um, Really right place, right time kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, a good colleague of mine was contacted by this TEDx to see if she would speak.
Mm-hmm.
And she was already scheduled to speak at another TEDx. And she referred me
Mm-hmm.
and they accepted me.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
what was the experience like?
Um, it was very challenging and very exciting. Challenging because I had not memorized something
Uh-huh.
since college, um, first 25 lines of Chaucer's prologue, I think, in freshman English was the last time I had to memorize something.
Uh-huh.
And, here it was 15 minutes worth. Um, so that was really a challenge. And also, it was hard to stand still on the red dot
Yeah.
because usually if I give a talk, I don't love large audience presentations because you can't communicate that well. I mean, you can engage them and they can laugh and all those things, but to
Mm-hmm.
really have a conversation, a smaller group is better. And I like not just the interaction, but having people think and change, et cetera, in the midst of it. And it's easier to accomplish that in a smaller group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was a wonderful, it was a real learning opportunity in a
Mm-hmm.
whole
Yeah.
variety of ways.
Yeah. And so I'm very curious to talk with you actually about that specific topic
Mm.
today on the podcast. I would love to hear from you, why is there so much conflict at work and what can we do about it? Because over the last couple of years, with the pandemic and with the hybrid working model, more people working from home and more isolation in that respect as well, I think there might be more conflict than ever. We can talk about all of that, but what is your take on that? And how do you think about that?
So let's start with why there's more conflict at
Mhm.
work.
Mhm.
Um, I think work structures are often not set up with a thought in terms of will everyone be comfortable? Will everyone agree?
Mhm.
And they are set up whether they are for measurement or evaluation or compensation or coordination of various kinds.
Mhm.
Procedures are most often set up to be efficient,
Mhm.
to make sure that something's done consistently, but they can put people at odds.
Mhm.
The classic example is a salesperson and you're head of manufacturing.
Mhm.
The salesperson wants to do whatever their customer needs, which may include customization and promising things and special
Mhm.
orders,
Mhm.
um, quick delivery, all kinds of challenges. The manufacturing person wants everything to be as standardized as possible because that's the way you are efficient and
Mhm.
you optimize your
Mhm.
cost and your resources. And each party is appraised and is rewarded either through compensation or other forms based on how well they do these functions that may not support each other.
Mhm. Mhm.
So these are underlying structures. Sometimes there are historical beliefs in an organization that can be very funny about one department being a bad department and one department being a good department. They take almost a religious kind of aspect. And then on top of that, we human beings are fairly sensitive. And we often misunderstand other people's intentions or think that what they want is not so good for us. And then we upset ourselves about that. So you put those two factors together, the structural issues, and then the human tendency to look for problems, to perceive problems, and you can get a lot of conflict.
Yeah, totally. And so what can you do about it when you recognize that there's a lot of conflict in your company or even in your life, right? On an organization level, but also on an individual level.
Yes. So there are a lot of different things that can be done that should be done depending on what your specific situation is. One of the first things has to do with self-management and looking at, how am I reacting to this? What is it about this situation that's actually causing me to feel in conflict? Because we don't use the term conflict if we just have a difference of opinion. We use it when we think a bad thing is happening. If it's just an exchange of views and it's lively and different people have different opinions and everybody's sharing them and nobody's upset, we don't call it a conflict. So the first thing is to examine, why am I perceiving this as a conflict? What's happening to me? And for that, it's very helpful to look at the body and what reactions we're having physically, because we respond to a conflict because we feel under threat. So whether it's the physical thing of hunching your shoulders or clenching your jaw, any of those kinds of things, relaxing your body first, because most work conflicts are not the kind of threat of somebody coming at you with a knife or, a tiger on the savannah. It's none of that. So calming ourselves first is important. And seeing what part we play in creating the conflict is also of great value, because anything you can do yourself to be calmer, to be more receptive, to understand the other party more, then you don't have to change anything about them. You don't have to change the structure. If you can manage it in yourself, you can actually eliminate it altogether. That doesn't happen all that often in the workplace, but it is possible. And it would be great if it happened more.
Right. How much is stress impacting that perception?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. And of course, a lot. Because when we are stressed, our body and therefore our brain, they're already responding as if they are under threat. And so everything is tightened down. When we feel under threat, we lose our peripheral vision. I mean, our sense perception actually changes. We don't take in as much. We are ready, whether it's for fight or flight, we are ready to respond as if this is the most serious thing that's ever happened. And most of the conflicts at work, they're annoying, but they're not deadly. And in most cases, they are not even a challenge to people's employment. They're more a challenge to either tradition, common practice in that place at this time, or to our egos.
Yeah, that's a super important highlight that I wanted to make, because, and I'm glad that you explained it so wonderfully, because, as this is the stress podcast and people are listening to understand where conflict is coming from at work as well, it's really, really important to talk about stress management and about how, when you are under high levels of stress on a regular basis, you will perceive more conflict around you, no matter if you really want it or not. But it is really important to take a moment to recognize that, right? Because as you said so well, self-management is actually the first step. And why is that the first step? It's because when we are experiencing high levels of stress and our brain is actually taking over and having that negativity bias of trying to keep us in the safe state and recognizing danger, everything actually in a heightened stress state seems more dangerous. And so that's the first step. So we self-manage and we examine, hopefully, if we have that awareness, has it something to do with how stressed I have been feeling over the last couple of days or weeks, and what can I do about that? Because oftentimes what I have learned within myself and with clients is that when you hopefully recognize that, and that's why you're listening to this podcast right now, because now you can really literally ask yourself the question, okay, is it maybe because there's been a lot going on, I've been working late, I've been experiencing a lot of pressure, maybe lots of personal things going on as well. The first thing that you can actually do is to take a step away from work,
Yes.
right? And to say, okay, how can I actually regulate my nervous system and bring myself back out of that fight or flight state, out of that sympathetic state, more into a parasympathetic state? And then you can check in with yourself and see, is it still feeling so, dangerous and aggravated an hour later after you've actually self-managed? Or is there really something that still needs to happen, right?
Could I even give another example, if you
Please.
don't mind, based on what
I love
happened
that.
to us just before we went live?
Mm-hmm.
So we had this little challenge.
Mm-hmm.
In the great scheme of things, it means nothing, but we had trouble getting the Zoom going
Mm-hmm.
because of a code problem. This is the kind of silly thing that could happen any day, 6 times a day.
Right.
We knew we had a limited time. I had never met you before. We're trying via email. I had already turned off all the phones, even though I did leave you a voicemail. I had already turned off all the phones, so if you tried to reach me, you wouldn't be able to. As a responsible person, I want to be on time. I want to be prepared. I want to come into the podcast in a responsible, mature way.
Mm-hmm.
I can't get in.
Mm-hmm.
Was I feeling stressed? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Right?
Right.
Could I have thought, what is the matter with this Julia person?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't she? Blah, 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 blah.
Right.
This is a natural human reaction,
Mm-hmm.
particularly when we do not already have a relationship of trust and safety
Mm-hmm.
with someone else, because we know we didn't do anything wrong. We're very likely to blame the other person
Mm-hmm.
for how we are feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I could have come into the podcast snarling, ready to be defensive. This would be normal human behavior. Luckily, we are both experienced,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just a podcast.
Right.
And as soon as we saw each other, we were smiling and we were fine.
Mm-hmm.
So after, and you took a moment to compose yourself before you started. And I was already doing, I have 47 different techniques for breathing and holding my body and feeling my feet in my shoes and all the things I tell clients to do. So we were both calm enough to go forward.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that helped me a lot, I don't know about you, is if you look at the other person that you think you're in conflict with and you think, oh, this is not a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
This is a fine person. It's okay to be here. Then you can relax. And if you smile at them and they smile at you, you can actually go on in a much better way.
Yeah, 100%. I love that you're mentioning that and that you're sharing our little story from this morning. Yeah, it's totally like that. And I always think when you do feel kind of triggered by a person, I always think, well, why does this trigger me, right? What does that what does that bring up within myself? And I also always think benefit of a doubt, because in 99% of the cases, this person doesn't know any better, right? In this case, today I had no idea that all of a sudden my Zoom required a passcode and I had no idea where to find it. And, there was just kind of like a scrambling on my side, of course, when I received your email. And so when you are, like taking this further into any other work situation, and also think about what is this other person dealing with? I think that's a really powerful question to ask yourself as well, right? We are quickly to blame other people when we are feeling stressed, to lay it onto somebody else and laying it onto the external environment, because that's so much easier than to examine ourselves, and then to ask yourself, what has this person been going through, right? Maybe they've had back-to-back meetings all day, or they are challenged in any other way that has made them to be not as performant as they usually show up to be. And so when you think about, because you were talking about self-management and obviously more like the organizational structures, would you say it's like a 50-50 split between how to resolve conflict at work, or is it actually more self-management? That was my first thought and question that I had when I saw your TEDx title. I was like, I wonder what Liz is actually talking about there.
That's too tough, Julia, to give it the percentages.
Right.
I don't know how to do that. I would say that when people feel that they are in conflict at work, they usually feel it is because of another person.
Mm-hmm.
They don't step back from the situation enough
Mm-hmm.
to look at what's in the environment that could be causing it. The other person is the closest thing they see, and so seems like they must be the cause, particularly because we don't call it a conflict until we're actually aggravated. We don't call it a conflict until we've made a judgment that the other person has done something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
If the other person did something and we're not upset by it, it's not a conflict. They could have made a mistake, but we just fix it and we go on.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when we perceive that they are in some way against us
Mm-hmm.
or making a problem for us, and that's when we label it a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So self-management is always the first because it's the thing you have the most access to, even though it takes practice.
Mm-hmm.
The more you practice, the quicker you can engage your own self-management.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I'm perfectly calm and I still think this other person is making a problem. What do I do then? So let's find out, what is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard to get to work problems that are structural, that are based on norms of the workplace, that are based on compensation conflicts or any of those things, without dealing with the human relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Because to get to the structural things, you have to engage with the people to figure out what the structures actually are.
Mm-hmm.
So the human part is always present.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, the benefit of the doubt, or just thinking the best of everyone. My kids would be annoyed with me when we were in the car and someone would cut in front of me or whatever. And I would say, oh, maybe they're on their way to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was silly, but it prevented me from getting upset.
Mm-hmm.
So believing the best about the other person is very important. And when you do that, you can let your curiosity kick in instead of your anger.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're curious, then you can ask the other person why they care about whatever the subject on the table is.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask them what's important to them. Learning more about why they take the position they take or behave the way they behave, that's such useful information because then you can find often small things you have in common.
Mhm.
We both want to serve the customer, but we're coming at it from a different angle.
Mhm.
So then we could discuss more about what the customer really wants. And is there a way that we can both serve the customer comfortably together? Whenever you can find values in common or purpose in common, it's a lot easier to calm down and be kind of methodical about what are the things we could do practically in the real world. Um, so learning more about the person and recognizing that in most cases, they really have no interest in harming you. They just want to accomplish whatever
Mhm.
their job is.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's such a powerful perspective. And you, as a management consultant and coach, when you get called to come into a business to manage conflict, how do you start? Where do you start?
Before I come in, I explain to the executive or whatever leadership team is hiring me
Mhm.
that it's a disruptive process,
Mhm.
that it is not. I talk to the two people involved and I give them magic words and we're all done.
Right.
Which is, some people really are hopeful that that could be the case,
Mhm. Mhm.
but it's not. In general, it involves quite a significant research process
Mhm.
that is understanding more about the organization, the people in it, and what they're trying to accomplish
Mhm.
and why they're perceiving the conflict. So I do a lot of interviews.
Mhm. Mhm.
Depending on the circumstance, I interview large groups of employees,
Mhm.
or sometimes it's individual executives, really depends.
Mhm.
But learning from them their perspectives, I then get the equivalent of a 360-degree picture
Mhm.
of the conflict.
Mhm.
And because they all give different kinds of answers, I learn not just about their feelings and why they're so upset, but often the kinds of procedural problems, systems issues, information flows, where people are not getting the resources and tools they need to do their jobs easily,
Mhm.
or there are actual barriers to
Mhm.
progress.
Mhm.
Then I present my findings
Mhm.
to whatever leadership group
Mhm.
could theoretically make changes in all those situations.
Mhm.
Usually, what we find is that there needs to be a lot of clarification
Mhm.
about procedures,
Mhm.
about processes, about language. It
Mhm.
is remarkable
Mhm.
in a leadership team that has worked together for many years how they can use the same terms and not mean the same thing.
Mhm.
But they think they do because they're using the same language.
Same word. Yeah.
So the clarity, what do we mean? And are we conveying instructions to our teams in ways that will help them collaborate or that will actually set them against each other?
Mhm.
That's where you can start uncovering where the changes need to be, even before you work on the interpersonal relationships.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I would imagine that, and that was my first thought. So I'm glad that that you mentioned that as well. That it's oftentimes maybe structures or procedures that the leadership team hasn't even thought about, and things that just need to be put in place in order to make things much clearer for
That's
the
right.
employees and the workforce. Yeah.
That's right. Or the procedures haven't been evaluated in 5 years.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, we know the marketplace changes much more quickly than that.
Right.
So we've made adjustments, but
Mhm.
we never actually went back and codified it
Mhm.
and made sure that all the teams know about all the changes.
Mhm. Mhm. And so then the conflict maybe between two people or between two teams then is resolved through the structural side. And less than through the relationship?
If you fix the structures, there's less to fight about.
Right.
If you only try to get the people to talk to each other in better ways and to have empathy for each other and to be kind to each other, but the underlying processes cause them to be upset with each other every day, all the behavioral stuff isn't enough. You know, the wound, you keep ripping the scab every time because the procedures are off. So I really try to work on the structural parts first. At the same time, though, if possible, it's useful to be able to facilitate the discussions that the upset parties are having rather than leaving them alone to continue with their bad behavioral patterns.
Right. Because I assume as well that once, you know, those relationships are difficult, maybe because it was a structural problem in the first place, but still there is like strong feelings between parties, then that it's sometimes not super easily resolved either.
That's exactly right. If we feel strongly, and again, what is a feeling? It's something that's happening between the body and the brain. So if we're feeling strongly, we assume we're right.
Right.
Right? Because why would I be upset if it wasn't important? I wouldn't bother with it. So we convince ourselves over again that the other party is creating a problem and that it's up to them to fix themselves so then we can be comfortable. But you could wait a long time. And this is how a lot of work process gets stalled. Projects and initiatives slow down because people aren't able to communicate with each other well if these things are still in play. So structures, facilitation, and then techniques. Some of them are the kind of calming techniques we've already talked about. And others are different ways of speaking to each other or holding certain things in mind while you're speaking to the other person.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. How did you learn about all of these different techniques and tools?
I would say quite a lot of trial and error. A lot. Also, a lot of reading, watching other material. It's always helpful to see how other people talk about conflict because there are always new things to learn. Humans are very similar under our trappings, under our specific roles, but you know, different people come up with new ways all the time. I also have read a lot of child development literature because when did we learn how we respond to conflict, to threat, to bad beliefs as children? Sometimes pre-verbally, you know, when we're very unsophisticated and all we're trying to do is keep ourselves safe. So going back to some child development things at various points has been useful.
Yeah, so interesting. Do you have a book that you would recommend listeners to read if they are curious to learn more about maybe their own behaviors and how they can better manage conflict in the future?
I'm not going to give you something that's conflict specific. Well, let me give you one and then another one. So one of the books that I think is the best in terms of the conversation around conflict is called Crucial Conversations. And of the books that are specifically about how do you have the conversation, I think that one covers a tremendous amount of what it is. But for thinking about other human beings, I like The Art of Possibility by Benjamin and Rosamund Zander.
Okay.
Ben Zander actually has one of the best TED Talks, one of the most watched TED Talks, and it's fantastic. and I really encourage it. And it is about the potential that human beings have and how you can attract or tap into that potential.
Mhm.
And when you think about people in that way, instead of the people who aren't doing the thing you want, who aren't giving you what you want, it makes it a lot easier to think of different ways to work with them.
Yeah. And I was just looking up on my phone, one of the titles that immediately jumped into my mind when you were talking about more like the developmental part and the more like childhood part of understanding how you actually learned how to deal with conflict, because I couldn't remember the name of the book anymore, and it's called The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck. Have you heard about that book?
Yes, yes, that's been out a long time.
Super, super long time, and it's so powerful. I love this book so much, and yeah, so if people are interested more in that developmental stage, definitely recommend that one as well. I've heard so much about Crucial Conversations. I've actually never read the book, but I'll add it to the list of my literature as well. Liz, how can people connect with you if they are curious to learn more about how to deal with conflict and maybe even watch your TEDx talk?
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. The easiest place is probably my website, which is lizkislik.com, LIZKISLIK.com. And there they will find a free ebook about the interpersonal aspects of conflict at work that may be helpful.
Awesome.
And of course, they can also find me on LinkedIn.
And I was just Googling Liz Kislik TEDx, and you'll find as the first search result the video on Liz's TEDx talk as well. So make sure to check that one out. It's really powerful and wonderful. And it has over 500,000 views, I believe. So congratulations on that.
Yes. On the TED site, it has over 500,000 views. On YouTube, it's still less. I don't know how they collect their views, but yeah.
Amazing. Well, Liz, thank you so much for being here with us today. I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad that we still made it work, even though we had some initial difficulties today to jump on the Zoom call. And I certainly hope that we'll see more of you in the future.
Thanks so much, Julia. I enjoyed it.
And if you have been listening to this podcast today and you feel like we shared some really valuable information, and it could be information that would benefit someone else as well, we would really appreciate it if you would share this podcast episode with that person that came to your mind. So thank you so much in advance already for doing that. And I do hope to hear you in the next podcast episode. Until then, take good care of yourself, and I'll talk to you soon.